Now, we define friendship as a voluntary relationship of two people that involves mutual liking. Children of different ages tend to use different criteria for choosing their friends. Between the ages of 0 to 7, so those are those preschool and like kindergarten years, this is where friendships are built on common interest and whether or not the individuals get along well. So this is where that kid gets a brand new Ninja Turtle backpack and wears it to school and notices another kid with a Ninja Turtle backpack, and then they instantly become best friends and they stay friends for years and years to come because they have that thing in common. They have that appreciation of Ninja Turtles. But as they get a little bit older, more criteria start to be added when it comes to determining new friendships. So between the ages of 8 to 11, common interest in getting along well still apply, but now they're adding desirable psychological characteristics like being trustworthy, being kind, being honest. So these are just much more important than they used to be, and this seems to be related to the child's developing understanding of themselves and their future goals and things of that nature. And then once they get close to those teenage years, ages 11 and older, they still care about common interest and getting along well and those psychological characteristics. But now they're adding another set of attributes, social attributes, such as loyalty and intimacy. These children, as they move into puberty and their body starts changing and their interests start changing to more sexual kinds of things, they do tend to be a bit more self-aware, a bit more self-conscious and fearful of humiliation if their friends are disloyal. And this intimacy is especially crucial for young girls. So there is a gender difference there when it comes to males and females, but the gender differences we see are relatively minor. Now, when we look at these friendships, what we generally see is that most children become friends with other children that are approximately the same age, the same gender, and the same racial or ethnic identity. As children get a bit older, this typically becomes less true, especially if they attend ethnically diverse schools. These kinds of cross-group friendships will help majority groups just form more positive attitudes. By having your child involved in a diverse play group, you just tend to reduce the negative effects of racism. Like they're just less likely to be racist. But whether or not these children are diverse in this regard, they do tend to have a lot in common. If they do form a friendship with another kid, that typically means they have some common interests. And they also will share their attitudes about school, they share their recreational pursuits. They tend to talk a lot about their future plans and life goals. So all this kind of stuff is shared, and that's typically positive. But there are negative things that these friends can share, such as drug use. Unfortunately, a lot of friends do pull others into these negative patterns of behavior. But children who develop good friendships, they do benefit from it substantially. They tend to have a higher self-esteem. They tend to be less likely to be lonely or depressed, and they tend to be better able to cope with stress. And just in general, they tend to be more pro-social. So, in a way of speaking, having a few good friendships opens up the door and gives you the skills that you need to develop more good friendships. It's like a snowball effect, basically. However, as I'm sure you're well aware, friendships aren't free. They aren't easy. They actually require a lot of effort to maintain, especially if that relationship involves things like co-rumination, where you have these deep emotional conversations about your personal issues. I'm sure you've had such conversations with your friends before, and you know how emotionally draining it can be. Obviously, you can't have these kinds of conversations all the time. There's just a limit to how much energy you have in a day. But co-rumination is an important aspect of young girls' friendships. So as a result, young girls do typically have a smaller and more tight-knit circle of friends than young boys. Now, as I mentioned, friendships can be a great thing, but they can also be a source of problems like drug use. Friendships can reinforce negative behaviors like being overly aggressive or taking unnecessary risks. So friendships are generally seen as a positive thing, but of course not every friend is created equal. As a parent, you just need to be aware of what kinds of individuals your child is forming friendships with, because if they do get put into a bad group, that's going to result in a whole lot of negative consequences. Now, how children group up is actually an interesting subject of research. Children initially will start to form up into small groups called cliques, so that's about 2 to 4 individuals. And then those cliques over time will merge together, forming crowds. So just to be clear, a clique is a small group of friends, and they tend to be very similar in age and sex and ethnicity and so on. But crowds, they tend to be a little bit more diverse. Obviously, they're more diverse because it's different cliques merging together. But all these different cliques, the reason why they merge together is because they do have some things in common. Oftentimes, one of the most important factors that they have in common is social status. So, like, I'm sure you remember which crowd you were a part of, but back in high school and elementary school and all that, I was in the nerd group. I was in the nerd crowd. So I hung out with all the other nerds, basically. And that did have a negative impact on my self-esteem, but also had a positive impact as well. It might seem strange to think about this, and we'll come back to this later, but the peer pressure from hanging around a lot of nerds was that I took school a bit more seriously. I tried a little bit harder, and my grades were improved as a result. But going back to how these groups form, when the cliques come together and they start to form into crowd, you start to see a structure develop. And that structure is based on what we call a dominance hierarchy, an ordering of individuals within a group in which group members with lower status defer to those with greater status. Now, what determines status in most cases depends on the individuals that we're looking at. Like if we're talking about younger boys, then the primary determinant is physical power. The boy who can punch the hardest, the boy who can, dominate the others most effectively is typically the one that is deferred to in this kind of hierarchy. But for other groups, for older boys and for girls of basically any age, the primary determinant of social status is whether or not you are outgoing, whether you're pro-social and you're charismatic, and also if you have the best skills or ideas to help achieve the group's goals. Like if your group is really into, I don't know, music of some kind, like if your group is like really into heavy metal music, that's the one thing your group has in common, and you are a musician, then they'll look up to you. They'll see you as a kind of a leader of that group, for example. Or if you are in the jock group and you are the MVP for the football team, then they'll probably defer to you because you're the one who's best able to help them win the game, right? So it's all about who has the best skills that the group deems to be important. So something I mentioned a moment ago is how peer pressure, the influence of your friends can be either positive or negative. And generally, this peer pressure is going to be more powerful towards children who are younger and socially anxious. So those are the kids that feel the strongest amount of pressure. Also, whenever they're in a situation where it's not clear what they're supposed to be doing, the standards of appropriate behavior are not clear, if the influencer, the person exerting that pressure, is of a higher social status within the group, and if that influencer is a part of their clique, it's one of their close friends. So peer pressure, we tend to think of it as this kind of negative thing, but as I keep saying, it doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing. While it can pressure children into doing problematic things, breaking the law, abusing drugs and whatnot, it can also pressure children into doing better in school and to trying harder in sports. It doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing, is all I'm saying. Now, I know this present part of the presentation is probably coming about 10 or so years too late, but I'd like to talk to you about how you can be more popular. Popularity, the research on popularity is really interesting because we found it's a lot simpler than most people realize. Popularity is largely based on having good social skills and being pro-social. In other words, if you want to be popular, be nice, be helpful. Help different people achieve their goals, and they'll admire you for it. So being pleasant, being friendly, sharing with other people, cooperating with other people, not causing disruptions, not being obnoxious. Like all these things are huge factors when it comes to determining popularity. So just think back to those popular kids that you might remember from your school, and maybe you don't realize it, but they probably were rather pro-social. Like, you probably didn't see all the stuff that they were doing when you weren't around, but it's very likely that they were helping most other people. But it's not just good enough to just be pro-social. Cultural expectations also play a major role. Like, for example, in China, it used to be the case that shyness was a sign of maturity. But their culture has changed due to economics. And now assertiveness is the desired trait. So it's done like a 180 degree shift. So shyness used to be preferred, and now shyness is not preferred. The complete opposite of shyness is preferred. So you do need to definitely keep up with the times. You need to be aware of how your culture is changing and adapt with that culture in order to remain popular. Now, depending on how well you can adapt in that way, and depending on your pro-social skills, you'll find yourself in one of these categories of popularity. So the first category would be the popular kids. So these are kids that are just simply liked by most people. That's exactly what it means to be popular. It means you're liked by most. And as I said, this is typically due to being more pro-social than other kids, or more respected, more culturally in touch. The complete opposite end of the spectrum would be rejected kids. It sounds mean to call them social rejects, but that's literally what they are. These are kids who are disliked by most of their classmates. And it's generally because they're doing the opposite of what they should do to become popular. They're being aggressive, or they're just not getting involved in other children's lives, or they're not staying in touch with cultural changes. Then you have the controversial kids, which do some of these things to a certain degree with one group, but not with another. So the result is that they tend to be intensely liked by one group, but intensely disliked by another. So they're very polarized. But most people are what you would call average when it comes to being popular. That just means some people like them, some people dislike them, but nobody has particularly strong opinions about that person. And then the last group would be the kids that we call neglected. So these are the ones that people just don't really even have opinions for. They may not even notice that they're there. These kids are ignored, not disliked or liked. They're just forgotten, basically. This is the kind of kid that just fades in the background in the class or out on the field or whatever. There's just nobody talks to them. It's kind of sad, but this is often the result of, just lacking emotional development and social skills. But when it comes to those rejected kids, those social rejects, we can predict who will be in that category to a certain degree. Because social rejection generally is caused by having parents who were social rejects themselves, or parents who are just more hostile in general, more combative, more intimidating. So yeah, social rejects. Or parents who just aren't around, parents who are inconsistent when it comes to their parenting skills, or they just don't show much warmth. And like I was saying, these are things that are signs that a child will be more socially rejected, because children, not only does this affect their emotional development, but they tend to repeat this pattern of behavior when they grow older. So when they become parents, they pass on this legacy of social rejection to their kids. They mimic a lot of those parenting behaviors. Now, some social rejects, as I was saying, they do tend to be rather hostile. Some children are much more aggressive than others, oftentimes due to how their parents treat them. And there's different kinds of aggression. First of all, you have what we call instrumental aggression. So this is when a child uses aggression to achieve some kind of explicit goal. Like maybe the child didn't have enough money to eat lunch that day, so they stole some food from a classmate, or they beat up, a child that's younger than them and took their money or something like that. The point is, these kids, they're not getting pleasure out of being aggressive. They're just being aggressive to survive, to get by on a day-to-day basis. When I think of instrumental aggression, I think of the movie Aladdin. Aladdin does this, especially in the beginning of the movie. When we first meet the character Aladdin, you see him stealing, and you see him fighting, and things like that. But not because he wants to, it's because he has to, right? The other kind of aggression is what we call hostile aggression. And now this is a clear sign of being one of these socially rejected children. This is what I often just refer to as bullying, because that's what it is. This is a kind of unprovoked aggression that seems to have the sole goal of intimidation, harassment, and humiliation. So, in other words, these kids are being aggressive just because it's fun to be aggressive. And when we do see kids engaging in this kind of aggression for the sake of aggression, what we generally see is that this escalates over time. So when they're younger, they tend to show signs of aggression towards animals, typically, or maybe even toys at first. But then that will slowly transition to other children, and when they grow older, that kind of aggression will just become more and more severe. So bullies do tend to grow up and become criminals, violent criminals. There is a link there. Now, the victims of bullying also suffer, obviously. They tend to have a lowered self-esteem, they tend to be more disliking of school, and they tend to be more lonely, anxious, and depressed. And bullies also tend to target people like this. So not only are they making children have these kinds of factors, but they also look for children with these kinds of factors to bully. So it's cyclical in that sense. So yeah, children who are bullies tend to be targets of bullies, or children who are socially withdrawn tend to be targets of bullies. To put it in another way, social rejects tend to take out their aggression on other social rejects. Now, the world is changing. Times are obviously changing. Technology is becoming increasingly more a huge part of young children's lives. Even children that are in preschool, they're already going online and interacting with other people. Online social networking is becoming the norm. But let's just focus on teenagers for now. When it comes to online social networking, most teens do go online daily nowadays, and they will share all aspects of their life online. That's pretty normal. From relationship problems they're having to what they had for lunch. Like, I have no idea why anybody wants to see your sandwich, but teenagers just love taking pictures of things and posting it on the internet. Whatever. I guess I'm out of touch with kids these days. But this kind of social networking generally is a good thing. It promotes self-disclosure. It produces higher quality friendships. It helps to maintain a connection with other people. And this is especially true for young boys. Young boys, generally, in our culture at least, they generally have trouble maintaining healthy relationships in person. They have trouble sharing their feelings and things like that. But when it comes to the internet, they feel a lot more comfortable with that. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's just generally what we see. Boys are more willing to talk about their feelings online than they are in person. But as more people go online, we also see more bullying online. That hostile aggression is transitioning to a social networking context, where you have people harassing and humiliating through texts, through photographs on, all various websites, like, I don't know, whatever kids use these days. I don't do the social networks that much. But besides social networking, there are other ways in which technology is changing the way children develop and maintain friendships. For a lot of children, they develop relationships with characters they see on TV. Nowadays, it's like Netflix and a lot of stuff like that, but they identify with these characters they see on TV and they develop kind of a relationship with them. And this isn't necessarily a problem, but it's something that parents generally need to be well aware of. The typical high school student, high school graduate, I should say, has watched over 2 years of television. That's a huge chunk of their life they're spending with generally fictitious friends. And a lot of parents are concerned about that. As I said, you should be concerned about what kind of stuff your child is watching. But just in general, we found very little evidence that TV viewing can affect things like attention span, the ability to concentrate, being passive, being uncreative, being lazy. These things just don't really seem to have much of a connection. But there are some strong connections, like violence and other kinds of harmful beliefs. If children are watching programs that are clearly fostering antisocial behavior, then they're going to be more likely to mimic that behavior. We've seen this in children, and like Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment, for example, but it applies to people of all ages. The more violent media you consume, the more likely you're going to, sponsor violent behavior. So watching televised violence can definitely teach children to engage in these antisocial behaviors more often. This has been a very clear research finding. The best way you can minimize this as a parent is to just be involved in the child's media consumption. I'm not saying you have to put restrictions on all kinds of things and ban certain programs, but I'm just saying be involved. Be there, explain to them what they're seeing, and why it's not okay, or why it is okay in certain consequences. They just need that kind of feedback. They need that kind of context that they can only get from an involved parent. Another big cause for concern for a lot of parents is violence in video games. And yes, violence in video games does seem to have that same kind of connection, but video games in general don't seem to be a harmful thing. Children who play video games excessively, they don't seem to be suffering from it in general. In fact, playing video games does seem to have some positive consequences. It tends to increase cognitive, like problem solving, like processing speed. It tends to increase spatial skills, like navigational kinds of skills. It increases like critical thinking skills, executive function kind of stuff. So the child's just developing their cognitive skills in general. But the exact effects of these video games on how they're going to affect cognitive development varies from game to game. Some games are just much better than others at helping a child develop their cognitive skills. Like Tetris, for example. Tetris has been heavily researched, and we found that it does help to develop children's perceptual spatial skills. Like they're better at like mentally arranging things in a two-dimensional or even a three-dimensional space. And games like Super Mario, for example, where you're running and jumping and things like that, this does help to teach them problem solving, like quick thinking kind of problem solving, but it also tends to encourage violent solutions to problems. I don't know when you played Super Mario last. Most people have played it, but so I can assume you have at some point. But if you haven't played Super Mario in a while, just try to think about how you deal with enemies in that game. You can either crush them under your feet, you can set them on fire, you can knock them off of cliffs, you can hit them with projectiles like flying turtle shells. It's a pretty violent game if you actually think about it. Just because it's cartoony, that doesn't mean it's not violent. But yeah, just be mindful of what kind of games your kids are playing, because those games can have a profound impact on their development. Like, you generally don't want your kids to be playing games that are just mindless. That's not going to help them at all. That you need to be challenging their intellectual capabilities in order for them to get any real benefit. And just to wrap up this section when it comes to how children interact with friends and things like that, as children do spend more time around others, they start to develop a better understanding of other people. Interacting with other people just helps them to better define themselves and define what it means to be like a friend, basically. And as children age, their descriptions of themselves and their descriptions of others will become progressively richer and more conceptual. Just for example, children of about 7 years of age, they tend to describe other children and other people in more concrete terms. Like if you ask them about their friends, they'll just say, oh, this guy likes to play basketball, he's so high, he's got brown hair, concrete terms, things that you could easily observe just by looking at the child. But when they get a bit older, when they get to the teenage years, like 14 years of age, for example, they tend to focus more so on abstract traits, like personality. Like they'll talk about their friends in terms of whether they're friendly, whether they're, smart, and things like that. And just in general, children tend to be more optimistic in their descriptions of others, preferring to focus more so on positive traits. Now, exactly how children's understanding of themselves and others changes over these early years has been the subject of numerous studies by a researcher of the name Selman. So this is Selman's stages of perspective taking. The first stage is what we call undifferentiated. We generally see this between the ages of 3 to 6 years. And this is when children know that the self, themselves, and others can have different thoughts and feelings, but they don't really understand why, and they do often confuse themselves with others in that regard. it's a little hard to explain what this is like because as adults we take it for granted. We've mastered these kinds of self-awareness skills and critical thinking skills, but they're just starting to develop it. They're just starting to differentiate themselves from others. The second stage is the social informational stage. That's between the ages of 4 to 9. This is when children are better able to differentiate themselves from others, and they understand why people might have different ideas. They understand perspectives are different because people have access to different kinds of information. The third stage is what we call the self-reflective stage, and this tends to occur between the ages of 7 to 12. And this is when children can view themselves as others do, and they understand that others can do the same. I like to think of this self-reflective stage as like a second-person perspective ability. It's like the child has the ability to project their perspective into someone else. They can see themselves from somebody else's point of view. That's what I mean by like a second-person perspective. Then the fourth stage is called the third-person stage, and we generally see this between the ages of 10 to 15. And this is when the child can kind of step out of their immediate situation and see how they and other people are viewed from like a third-person perspective. So instead of seeing themselves from some other individual's perspective, they're seeing themselves from like a neutral observer's perspective. Just think of like a third-person video game where the camera is like floating above your character, and you can see all the immediate surroundings, and you can see what is influencing your character. That's basically what this stage is like. So people gain that ability to understand themselves in that kind of contextual way. And then the final stage is called the societal stage. We generally see this as the child grows older than 14 years. And this is when they realize that there is a much larger context out there. They start to understand how a much broader system of factors is affecting their current behavior, like the personal factors and societal and cultural contexts. So just think of that third-person camera I was talking about and just like zoom it way out. That's basically what they're doing. They're zooming out and they can see more and more of the context that surrounds them. So those are Selman's 5 different stages. But when it comes to understanding the self and understanding others, one very popular subject of research in this regard has to do with prejudice of many kinds. Typically, once children can differentiate themselves from others, when they can differentiate entire groups from each other, and they've identified which group they belong to, they will start to show signs of prejudice behavior. So this begins at about the age of 6, which should make sense according to Selman's timeline. Now, initially, this prejudice behavior is basically just showing a preference for their group. There's no real hostility at first. There's no real fear or hatred or anything like that. It's just they perceive other groups as not being as good. They perceive other groups as being disadvantaged in some way. It's kind of like the kid is just looking at this other group saying, it's too bad you couldn't be in the cool group like me. Those negative beliefs, those negative behaviors come later. They will start to develop more hatred, more fear, more hostility in general, especially if they think that other group feels the same way about them. So it's kind of like a defensive reaction, if you think of it that way. But there are things you could do to try to reduce this, and I already kind of mentioned this earlier on. If you want to try to reduce prejudice, if you want to try to eliminate, this kind of discrimination, the best thing you could do is get your child involved in social groups that are more diverse. But also make sure you encourage friendly interaction. You don't want these different groups to be, these different like ethnicities or sex groups to be competing with each other. That can actually increase hostility instead of decrease it. So you need to make sure they're cooperating when they are together. Other important factors of or that they should be of equal social status, because if there's any perceived inequality, that will just amplify the disconnection. Other obvious things that you can do to try to minimize prejudice is to not demonstrate it in front of them. You know, just model good non-prejudiced behavior in front of them, and they will copy a lot of what they see you do. Another really good thing you can do to try to reduce prejudice is to talk to your older children about it. Explain to them the history of prejudice that has affected not only their group but other groups, and how times have changed. So it's important that you do these kinds of things, especially as a child starts to grow older, to try to eliminate prejudice. And if all parents can do this, if we can all make the effort to try to teach our children about prejudice behavior in the past and try to model good non-prejudiced behavior in the present, then in the future it's very unlikely we'll have to deal with the kind of problems we're dealing with today.